So last time, back when I did this in May, I did something very abstract and philosophical, talking about why we believe what we believe, why we believe the Bible, and all that. So this time I wanted to change pace. I wanted to do something very practical, very tangible, and applicable to our everyday lives, especially people our age. So I thought, what could be more relevant to us than talking about the media? That's why my topic tonight is media and the Christian. I think we all understand just how much media impacts our daily lives. Most of us, when we think of media, we think about social media. That's the first thing that comes to our minds. That's one of the things I want to talk about. But I'm also going to be talking about any means of mass communication. So TV, radio, internet, books, etc. So that's what I mean when I talk about media. Anything that means of communicating, mass communication of content and information. So that's our topic tonight. And you look at some statistics. Americans, you get different numbers, but generally the numbers I find for the most part is that Americans spend about 7 hours of screen time every single day on average. And surely, a big chunk of that is us engaging with media, internet, shows, so on and so forth. Obviously that varies from age group to age group, but the average is about 7 hours of screen time, and within that, a big chunk of that is us, consuming media. So, the point being that this is a very, very relevant and very, very prominent part of our lives. So I think it's really important to talk about it. So before I get into anything, I just want to start by saying I suspect that this will be a very challenging devotional for every one of us in this room tonight, myself included. Sometimes, as Christians, we decide we're laying our lives down at the feet of Christ, and we're taking our cross, and we're going to follow Him. And sometimes that requires us to make, hard and difficult changes and difficult sacrifices in our life. So that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. And I need to hear this Devo just as much as anybody else, if not more. And I'll talk about some of the areas where I've struggled and where I continue to struggle with this. So just keep that in mind as we go. So this Devo is largely based on and inspired by a lesson from a favorite preacher of mine, Don Blackwell, called Managing Media in Our Homes. I strongly recommend that you go check this out. It's on YouTube, very easy to find. In this lesson, he talks about a time he went to a friend's house of his, and he saw a sign right by his friend's TV that said, "How dare we be entertained by the things that sent Jesus to the cross?" How dare we be entertained by the things that sent Jesus to the cross? This is certainly a biblical sentiment. A couple of verses here. Psalm 101, verse 3. I will set no vile thing before my eyes. I hate the work of those who fall away. It shall not cling to me. Romans chapter 1, verse 32. This is right after he lists a long list of different sins. And he says, and although they know the righteous requirement of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them. And I think whenever we're engaging with media that engage in all these different sins that he's just listed, that's us giving approval to people who practice these things, and we're encouraging that and we're enabling that in a way, and I think we are. Last verse, Proverbs 8, verse 13, the fear of Yahweh, the fear of the Lord, is to hate evil. Pride and arrogance and the evil way, and the mouth of perverted words, I hate. So, when it comes to the entertainment we consume, we need to remember that God cares about our minds. God cares about our minds. A classic, Romans 12, verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may approve what the will of God is, that which is good and pleasing and perfect. Can we really be transformed by the renewing of our minds if we're constantly consuming filth? Can we really be transformed? Can we honestly say we're being transformed day by day in the renewing of our minds if we're constantly, garbage in, garbage out? Another classic, Proverbs 4, verse 23, guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. If you ask anybody our parents' age or our grandparents' age, you ask them, has something changed in our entertainment over the years, in our culture over the years, and what they're producing, specifically in terms of the morals and the values that our entertainment industry is putting out there? And without a doubt, I guarantee you every single one of them will say yes. Something has changed. Exhibit A, I would have to say, is the recent display that was put on at the Grammys this year. The overt satanic imagery and brazen immodesty, and the applauding of radical gender ideology, and all of that, in your face at the Grammys. One of the big things that we're supposed to, one of the big cultural things that happens every single year. Exhibit B, I think, would be when we watch this year's Super Bowl halftime show and we're surprised at how tame it is. Right? And that's, in large part because Rihanna was pregnant. So, I think that's, something has clearly changed. When our parents were our age, a lot of the stuff we're seeing would never have been tolerated in American culture, and never would have been put out there. And we look at, some of the top shows that Americans are watching today, and there's just a vast increase of sexual content and profanity and so on and so forth. And we see some of our nation's most prominent politicians going on and making appearances with shows hosted by transvestites and all these things that never would have been accepted, a matter of mere decades ago. And we see this, we look around, and we wonder, how did this happen? How did this happen? I mean, just a few short decades ago, none of this would ever have been tolerated by our culture. How did this happen? I submit to you that it's because we let it happen. We let it happen. Us, Christians, we let it happen. They introduce, little by little, they introduce characters in our shows who will sleep around, and they'll be praised for it, and we'll tolerate that. And then they'll start using profanity more and more. They'll start using it constantly, and we'll stomach that. And we get so interested in the plot lines and all these things, and we stomach all these things. And all of a sudden, they're starting to introduce, and normalize homosexuality in our shows, and mocking religion, mocking Christianity, just outright mocking Christianity. And we stomach this, and this grows and grows and gets worse and worse. We tolerate more and more. So I think at a certain point, we as Christians, we have to draw a line and say, no, if they say this, if they show this, I am not going to watch that. I'm going to turn it off. I have to draw a line somewhere. We can't let them continue to get worse and worse in their wickedness and their brazen flaunting of our values as a culture and as Christians. We can't tolerate that. Certainly not in our own lives, and we should do some work to be a force in the culture for good, pure, wholesome entertainment. How dare we be entertained by the things that sent Jesus to the cross? So one thing that I've had to change in the past several years in my entertainment. So one of my favorite shows watching with my family growing up when I was in high school was Big Brother. And, for those of you who don't know, it's basically Survivor, but in a house in LA. And one day I realized, I shouldn't be watching the show anymore. My conscience got to me. Just the lying, the backstabbing, the foul language, the immodesty, the greed, just all in the show. And I caught myself cheering for them to destroy one another. I wasn't engaging in any of these things. I wasn't the one who was lying or backstabbing or anything. But Romans 1:32, I was approving to those who practice such, right? So I just got to the point where I could, no longer in good conscience, for me personally, I couldn't watch that show anymore. And it's happened with a couple other shows as well. And, let me be clear, I'm not saying that no Christian ever should watch Big Brother. No Christian ever should watch this show or that show. I'm just saying, it's a matter of the heart, right? If you find yourself, convicted in watching a particular thing, you're saying, this thing is really not a good influence on my inner life, and it's really starting to corrupt me from the inside. It's time to give it up. We need to be willing to give that up. Be of sober spirit, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Do you think the devil's at work in our entertainment? Do you think he's at work in our media today? I think if you say no, you have not been paying attention. Let me be clear. Again, I'm not saying that media is inherently evil, right? Media is a lot like money. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad. We can use the media to spread the gospel to the world. And it's such a great blessing to have the media. And one day God will ask us, if we fail to do our due diligence in bringing the Great Commission to the world, we can't have an excuse because God has blessed us with the media. We can use that to reach everybody in the world. But again, it depends on how we're using it. And we need to be very cautious, similar to money, and be mindful of how we're using it and whether it's corrupting us. One of the things that Don Blackwell said in his lesson that I mentioned in the beginning, he said, the love I have for my Lord ought to exceed my love for my favorite TV show. And I think this is a good verse to point to that. The love I have for my Lord ought to exceed the love I have for my favorite TV show. Another thing he asks in a different lesson, am I someone who seeks to avoid that which is questionable? Or am I someone who tries to get away with as much as I can and sacrifice as little as possible to the Lord? I think a lot of us, myself included, we need to ask that to ourselves constantly. Am I trying to justify the things that I watch, the things that I'm read, and things that I seek out? Am I trying to justify these things? Am I trying to defend the indefensible? Am I trying to get away with as much as I can and sacrifice as little as possible to the Lord? I think that's something we all need to ask ourselves constantly. Another classic verse, 1 John 2:15, do not love the world nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So the key question I think we need to ask ourselves when it comes to our entertainment is this. Whenever I'm considering a particular show or movie or whatever I'm watching, what we need to ask ourselves is, can I really honestly call this a source of pure, wholesome entertainment? If I'm honest with myself, can I call this a pure, wholesome source of entertainment? And some people I know are probably thinking, well, Brandon, if you're saying we can't ever have this or that in our media, that means we can't watch anything. And first of all, I don't think that's the case at all. I really don't think your horizons are not broad enough for the things that you consider watching. But even if that is the case, that doesn't mean that we need to compromise on our values just for our favorite TV show or our favorite movie or our favorite radio program, so on and so forth. That's absolutely no good reason for us to compromise on our values. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is dignified, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, consider these things or meditate on these things. Whatever is dignified, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable. Meditate on these things. So I talked about how I mentioned social media tonight. I think we all know, social media is forever. That's been well established at this point. It's been around for a while now. So even a lot of secular people have figured out what not to post. And I think probably a lot of us are really good at watching what we do and don't post, but it's still worth mentioning. I think there's two key questions when it comes to the things that we're putting out there. Things that we need to ask ourselves every time before we hit post. Number one, how is this going to impact my Christian influence? And number two, how is this going to reflect upon the church? People take note. People take note of the things that you post, and they think, is that what a Christian posts? And it not only reflects on yourself, it reflects on all of us. It impacts all of us, everything you post. Again, I think that's something we all know. It just bears repeating. A couple verses just for consideration regarding what we put out there. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for building up what is needed, so that it will give grace to those who hear. And in Colossians 4, 5, and 6, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, redeeming the time. Let your words always be with grace, seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should answer each person. So one thing I think we should mention when it comes to social media, what about posting things about politics? One thing we should always remember, 1 Corinthians 6:20, we are not our own, but we are bought with a price, right? So we need to be very, very careful not to try to be the one who's right? It's not about us. We were bought at a price. We are not our own. And now, certainly, there are issues where Christians have to have enough backbone to speak up and say something. Absolutely, I'm not denying that. What I am saying is that we need to be very, very careful about when we do this. Very, very careful. We certainly don't need to be constantly blasting specific politicians or, arguing back and forth about marginal tax rates, right? That's not what we should be arguing about on social media. Remember, think about how that impacts your Christian influence. Think about how that reflects upon the church. We need to remember that seldom has anybody ever changed their mind as a result of a debate in a comment section. We need to be thinking about whether that's worth it. I think a good piece of advice that's applicable, what Jesus said to the 12 before he sent them out on the limited commission. He said, "Behold, I am sending you out amongst sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents, as innocent as doves." And I think that's something we need to consider whenever we're in a culture that's increasingly hostile to our worldview and what we believe. So whenever we speak up, I think we need to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. This isn't exact science, but remember, be wise as serpents, be innocent as doves. Last thing I want to talk about regarding media and being a Christian, time management. I mentioned at the top about 7 hours of screen time for the average American today. A lot of that might be work, but certainly a lot of it is entertainment. Hours upon hours. It ends up being months out of a year spent watching TV or watching Netflix, so on and so forth. When we think about time management, it's usually something we think about in the business world, but time management is really a Bible topic as well. John 9:4, Jesus says, we must work the works of him who has sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when we can no longer work, when no one can work. And then Ephesians 15 through 16, therefore look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. The laborers are few, but the harvest is many. There's so much work to be done. So we need to be mindful of the things that, the time that we're spending consuming entertainment, consuming these things. Something we also need to consider, is my leisure time taking away from Bible study time? Is my leisure time taking away from times that should be spent in prayer? Or time that could be spent with my family or loved ones? I think if we make time to check Facebook or check Twitter in a given day, but we didn't make time to read our Bible, I think we really need to reevaluate where our priorities are and really examine ourselves and try to have more discipline. And this is the area I really struggle with, is time management. Not getting sucked into the black hole that is social media and allowing that to control your life. I'm not an expert on how we should go about this. I'm trying to figure this out myself. But certainly there are many ways of managing your screen time out there, many apps and different things that can help you. And once again, we need to be willing to make sacrifices. If your hand causes you sin, cut it off, right? Also regards to time management, one thing Paul says to the Corinthians, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. All things may be lawful, but don't allow ourselves to be mastered by anything. How dare we be entertained by the things that sent Jesus to the cross? If you don't take anything away from tonight, I want you to remember that. Again, it's a matter of our heart. It's a matter of us looking inwardly. And how is this show, how is this book, how is this radio program, how is this music affecting me? Is this filth that I shouldn't be consuming, that isn't conducive to the renewing of my mind? Things we need to think about. And I certainly have a lot of work to do in this area. I suspect that every single one of us does. And I hope this Devo challenged you or helped you in some way. Thank you so much for your kind attention. That's all I had tonight. Go ahead and bow with me in prayer. Father God, it feels like it's getting harder and harder each day to walk in the light when we're surrounded by so much darkness. God, help us to rid ourselves of the darkness and the filth that's in our lives. And God, help us as we try to build the strength to live and bear our cross day by day. We ask that you would help us in the renewing of our mind through your word and through being with fellow believers and spending time with you in prayer and God, in meditating on your word. God, we thank you so much for this opportunity to gather together. Help us to take these things and apply them in our lives. Help us to have the self-control and the will to make sacrifices and clean up our lives, and help us to follow the example of Jesus. God, we thank you so much for Jesus. We thank you for his blood that makes relationship with you possible. God, we want to make mention of those families in Nashville as they're victims of a recent shooting. We pray that you would bring comfort to them and their families and in that community, God. And God, help them in this time of mourning. Once again, thank you so much for Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.